Welcome to Dr. Harmony. They say the people who are supposed to love you the most are often the ones who hold the knife closest to your heart. Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own home, invisible until you're being criticized? Today's story is a powerful journey of a man who was treated like nothing by the woman he gave everything to. It is a tale of cold betrayal, a secret transformation, and a homecoming that changed everything. If you've ever been underestimated or pushed to your breaking point, this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end to see how the scales of justice finally balanced out in the most unexpected way. Let's dive into the story of Arthur and the price of a prideful heart. The rain lashed against the windows of the small, cramped apartment, mirroring the storm that had been brewing inside Arthur's heart for years. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands calloused from 12-hour shifts at the construction site, staring at a cold plate of dinner. Across from him sat Elena. She didn't look at him. She never really looked at him anymore, unless it was to point out a flaw or complain about the mounting bills. To Elena, Arthur wasn't a partner. He was a disappointment wrapped in a dusty work jacket. She sighed loudly, a sound filled with a poison that Arthur knew all too well. She threw a glossy magazine onto the table, pointing at a picture of a diamond-encrusted watch. She told him that the husband of her friend had just bought her a car that cost more than Arthur earned in 3 years. She asked him, with a voice as sharp as glass, why she was cursed to live such a pathetic life with a man who had no ambition. Arthur didn't argue. He had learned that arguing with Elena was like trying to stop a flood with a paper shield. He simply reminded her that he was working every overtime shift available to save for the house she always talked about. But Elena laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed in the tiny kitchen. She told him that a man like him would never own a house like that. She called him a beast of burden, someone meant to toil in the mud while people with real talent and class enjoyed the sunlight. The words stung more than the physical exhaustion in his bones. He looked at the woman he had married 10 years ago, the woman he had once shared dreams with, and realized she was gone. In her place was a stranger fueled by greed and a toxic sense of entitlement. The breaking point didn't come with a shout, but with a whisper of realization. That night, Arthur overheard Elena on the phone with her mother. She didn't know he was standing in the hallway. She told her mother that she was tired of waiting for Arthur to become someone. She said she was planning to leave him as soon as she found someone who could actually provide the lifestyle she deserved. She called him a dead weight and admitted she had been embarrassed to introduce him to her colleagues at the new gallery where she worked. Arthur felt a cold numbness spread through his chest. He wasn't just being disrespected, he was being discarded like a piece of broken furniture. He didn't confront her that night. Instead, he walked back to the living room, sat on the sagging sofa, and made a decision. He realized that as long as he stayed in this toxic environment, he would continue to wither away. He had a secret that even Elena didn't know, a mind for mathematics and architectural design that he had suppressed to take immediate, high-paying manual labor jobs to support her art degree. He had been sacrificing his future to fund her present, and all he got in return was her contempt. The next morning, before the sun had even touched the horizon, Arthur packed a single duffel bag. He didn't take much, just his basic clothes, his old drafting tools, and the small amount of cash he had stashed away for an emergency. He left his wedding ring on the kitchen table next to a note that simply said, "You were right. You deserve the life you want, and so do I." He walked out the door without looking back. He could hear the city waking up, the hum of engines and the distant whistle of a train. For the first time in a decade, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter, even though he was walking into the unknown with nothing but his grit. Elena woke up 2 hours later, expecting her coffee to be ready and her breakfast served. When she found the empty kitchen and the note, her first emotion wasn't sadness, it was anger. She scoffed, thinking Arthur was throwing a tantrum and would be back by dinner, crawling on his knees to apologize. She told herself she was glad he was gone. She went to work, telling her friends that she had finally liberated herself from a man who was holding her back. She waited for a week, then a month, then a year. Arthur never called. He never sent a message. It was as if he had vanished off the face of the earth. Elena moved on, quickly finding a man who looked successful on paper, a smooth talker named Julian, who promised her the world. But as the months turned into years, the colorful life she envisioned began to fade into a gray reality of debt and deception. She had no idea that miles away, in a different city, under a different name, the man she had mocked was rebuilding himself from the ground up, stone by stone, until he became a titan she wouldn't even recognize. Arthur arrived in the city of Oakhaven with nothing but his duffel bag and a burning fire in his chest that no amount of rain could extinguish. He found a room in a boarding house that smelled of old wood and loneliness, but to him, it smelled like freedom. He didn't waste a single second. During the day, he worked at a local shipyard, hauling steel and coordinating logistics. But while the other men went to the bars at night to drown their exhaustion, Arthur went to the public library. He sat there until the lights flickered, burying his head in advanced structural engineering books and investment law. He discovered that the years he spent on construction sites weren't just manual labor. They were a masterclass in how things were built from the ground up. He understood the bones of a building better than the architects who drew them. He started small. He noticed a flaw in the shipyard's loading system that was costing the company thousands in delays. Instead of complaining, he spent a week drawing up a redesigned schematic on scraps of blueprint paper. When he finally gathered the courage to show it to the foreman, the man laughed. But the owner of the company, a sharp-eyed veteran named Elias, happened to be walking by. Elias looked at the drawings, then at Arthur's calloused hands, and then back at the drawings. He saw a precision that couldn't be taught in schools. It was born of sweat and survival. Elias offered Arthur a chance: manage a small, failing renovation project for a warehouse downtown. If he succeeded, he'd get a bonus. If he failed, he was back to hauling steel. Arthur didn't fail. He worked 20 hours a day, negotiating with suppliers and working alongside the crew. He finished the project 2 weeks ahead of schedule and 30% under budget. Meanwhile, back in the city, Arthur had left behind. Elena's life was beginning to crack. The man she had replaced Arthur with, Julian, was everything she thought she wanted. He wore tailored suits, drove a luxury sedan, and spoke about international investments. But Julian was a mirage. He didn't have wealth. He had a mountain of credit card debt and a talent for predatory charm. Elena, desperate to maintain her image of a high society gallery owner, began funneling her own savings into Julian's business ventures. She told her friends that Arthur was probably living in a gutter somewhere, while she was ascending to the throne she deserved. She didn't realize that Julian was slowly draining her dry, using her ego as the straw. In Oakhaven, Arthur's reputation began to soar. He didn't buy a fancy car or designer clothes. He lived like a monk, reinvesting every penny into a small real estate firm he started in a rented basement. He had an uncanny ability to find broken properties, buildings that everyone else thought were worthless, and see the hidden gold beneath the grime. He treated his workers with a respect he had never received, and in return, they gave him their absolute loyalty. He became known as the man who could build a palace out of ruins. Within 3 years, Arthur's firm, Zenith Development, was no longer a secret. He was no longer the beast of burden Elena had mocked. He was a visionary. His frame grew lean and strong, his eyes lost their weariness and gained a piercing clarity, and his voice carried the weight of a man who knew his own worth. Back at the gallery, Elena received a final notice from the bank. The building was being sold. Julian had vanished 3 days prior, taking the last of her liquid assets and leaving behind a trail of lawsuits. She sat in her darkened office, the very place where she used to brag about her superiority, and felt the walls closing in. She was losing everything. Her friends, the ones who had cheered when she belittled Arthur, were nowhere to be found now that the champagne had run out. She was forced to move into a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment on the edge of town, ironically, a place much worse than the one she had shared with Arthur. She spent her nights bitter and hollow, blaming the world, blaming Julian, and still, in her darkest moments, blaming Arthur for leaving her unprotected. Arthur, now a multimillionaire with a portfolio that spanned the coast, sat in his high-rise office overlooking the Oakhaven harbor. He received a report from his private investigator. He had kept a distant eye on the city he left behind, not out of longing, but out of a calculated need for closure. He saw the photos of the gallery's foreclosure. He saw the reports of Julian's fraud. He saw a photo of Elena, looking haggard and tired, walking into a grocery store with a handful of coupons. There was no joy in his heart, only a cold, clinical sense of irony. He realized that the greatest revenge wasn't causing her pain. It was becoming so successful that her opinion of him became completely irrelevant. But there was one final task he needed to complete. He wasn't a man who liked loose ends. He still had a legal tie to a woman who had tried to bury his spirit. He looked at the divorce papers on his desk, unsigned for years. He decided it was time to return. Not as the man who ran away in the middle of the night, but as the man who owned the very ground she walked on. He called his assistant and told her to prepare the private jet. He was going back to his old city, but he wasn't going home. He was going to a graveyard of memories to finally bury the past. He dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than their old apartment, strapped on a watch that represented a year of his old salary, and stepped into the sunlight. The hunt for closure had begun. Arthur's return to the city was not marked by a grand parade, but by a quiet, suffocating power. As the wheels of his black sedan rolled over the familiar, pothole-ridden streets of his old neighborhood, he felt like a traveler from another dimension. Everything looked smaller, grittier, and more pathetic than he remembered. He passed the construction site where he used to break his back for pennies, and for a moment he saw the ghost of his younger self covered in dust, head bowed, rushing home to a woman who would only tell him he wasn't enough. He felt a pang of pity for that man, but it was quickly replaced by the cold steel of his current resolve. He wasn't here for a reunion. He was here for a reckoning. He instructed his driver to pull up to a sleek, modern office building in the financial district. This was the headquarters of the law firm he had hired to handle his affairs. He didn't want a simple divorce. He wanted a surgical separation. He sat in a glass-walled conference room, looking out at the skyline. His lead attorney, a sharp woman named Sarah, entered with a thick folder. She informed him that Elena had been easy to track. After the gallery went bankrupt and Julian disappeared with her money, she had fallen into a cycle of low-paying jobs and mounting debt. She was currently working as a hostess at a mid-tier bistro, struggling to keep her head above water in a world that no longer cared about her family name or her supposed class. Sarah handed Arthur a document. It was a comprehensive list of Elena's current liabilities. She owed back taxes, she was months behind on rent, and she had several private loans with predatory interest rates. Arthur looked at the numbers. To him, the total was pocket change, the cost of a few marble slabs for one of his lobby designs. To Elena, it was a mountain that was slowly crushing her to death. Sarah asked if he wanted to settle her debts as part of the divorce agreement. Arthur looked out the window, a grim smile touching his lips. He told Sarah that he didn't want to make things easy for her. He wanted her to see exactly what she had thrown away. He wanted her to understand that while she was busy looking for a king to save her, the man she called a beast of burden had built his own empire. The plan was set. Arthur wouldn't meet her in a dark alley or a lawyer's office. He wanted the setting to be poetic. He discovered that the bistro where she worked was actually located in a building that had recently been acquired by one of his subsidiary companies. Without her knowing, he was already her landlord. He decided to pay a visit. He told Sarah to send the formal divorce summons to the bistro during the dinner rush, and he would be there to witness the delivery. It was a cold move, perhaps even a cruel one, but Arthur remembered the nights he spent crying in the shower so she wouldn't hear him, and the way she had laughed when he talked about his dreams. Mercy was a luxury he wasn't ready to afford her yet. The night of the confrontation was humid and heavy. Arthur arrived at the bistro 10 minutes before the scheduled delivery. He wore a mask of professional indifference, his eyes shielded by expensive sunglasses, even as the sun began to set. He sat at a corner table, tucked away in the shadows. When the hostess approached to offer him a menu, he felt a jolt of electricity. It was her. Elena looked older. The spark of arrogance in her eyes had been replaced by a weary, frantic flicker. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, and her hands, which she used to boast were made for fine art, were now stained with the mundane grime of service work. She didn't recognize him at first. To her, he was just another wealthy businessman in a suit she couldn't afford to touch. She spoke in a practiced, submissive tone, asking if he was waiting for someone. Arthur kept his voice low and raspy, barely a whisper. He told her he was waiting for a ghost. She laughed nervously, a shadow of her former mocking laugh, and moved away to attend to another guest. Arthur watched her. He watched her take orders, apologize for late food, and endure the rude comments of entitled customers. He saw her living the very life she had once accused him of forcing upon her. The irony was a bitter pill. She had wanted status so badly that she had abandoned the only person who would have actually given it to her. Then, the doors opened. A man in a plain suit walked in, carrying a legal envelope. He walked straight to the hostess stand. The entire restaurant seemed to go quiet for Arthur as he watched the scene unfold. The server handed the papers to Elena, stating her full name and confirming she had been served. Elena's face went pale. She looked at the return address on the envelope. It didn't say Arthur's name, it said Zenith Development Holdings. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers, likely thinking it was another lawsuit or an eviction notice. But as she read the first page, her breath hitched. Her eyes darted around the room, frantic and confused, until they landed on the man in the corner. Arthur slowly stood up. He removed his sunglasses, allowing the dim light of the bistro to hit his face. The transformation was complete. He stood tall, his posture commanding, the air around him vibrating with the confidence of a man who owned the world. Elena's jaw dropped. She dropped the papers, the white sheets fluttering to the floor like fallen leaves. She tried to speak, but only a small, choked sound came out. She looked at his suit, his watch, and then finally, into his eyes. There was no love there, no anger, just a vast, empty silence that was louder than any scream. Arthur walked toward her, each step echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. The dead weight had returned, and he was heavier than she could ever have imagined. The silence in the bistro was suffocating. Elena leaned against the hostess podium, her knuckles white as she gripped the wood for support. The customers around them blurred into a background of insignificant noise. To her, the world had shrunk down to the man standing 5 feet away, the man she had once called a failure, now looking like the architect of her destruction. She tried to find the words, her lips trembling, but the arrogance that had once fueled her voice had long since withered. Finally, she managed to whisper his name, a broken sound that barely carried across the air. Arthur didn't flinch. He looked at her with the cold, detached curiosity of someone observing an insect under glass. He didn't see his wife. He saw a ghost of a mistake he had made a decade ago. He picked up the divorce papers she had dropped, his movements fluid and expensive. He placed them back on the podium with a rhythmic tap of his finger. He told her, in a voice that was smooth and terrifyingly calm, that he had come to settle the debt. Not the financial debt she owed the world, but the debt of time and energy he had wasted, believing she was worth his sacrifice. Elena's eyes welled with tears, but they weren't tears of love or even regret for her actions. They were tears of shock and envy. She asked him where he had been, how he had done this, and why he hadn't told her. Her mind was already racing, calculating if there was a way to salvage this, if she could charm her way back into the life he clearly now led. She reached out to touch his sleeve, a desperate gesture of familiarity, but Arthur stepped back. The movement was subtle, but it felt like a slap. He told her that he had become the man she said he could never be, the moment he stopped trying to be the man she wanted. He began to walk through the restaurant, and instinctively, she followed him, oblivious to her duties or the staring eyes of the patrons. They stepped out onto the sidewalk, where the black sedan waited like a predator in the night. Arthur leaned against the car, the city lights reflecting off the polished paint. He told her the truth, that he was the owner of the very building she worked in. He told her that while she was chasing shadows like Julian, he was building a legacy. He revealed that he had watched her gallery fall, not because he wanted to stop it, but because he wanted to see if she would finally learn how to build something of her own. She hadn't. She had simply looked for another hand to hold. Elena started to plead. She spoke of how hard it had been, how Julian had tricked her, and how she had thought about Arthur every day. It was a lie. and they both knew it. She told him that they could start over, that now they had the resources to be the power couple she had always dreamed of. Arthur laughed, then a short, dark sound that had no humor in it. He told her that they didn't have anything. He had resources. She had an eviction notice and a pile of legal documents. He reminded her of the night she called him dead weight on the phone with her mother. He told her that he had taken her advice, he had cut the weight, and look how high he had soared. The realization began to sink in for Elena. This wasn't a romantic movie where the husband returns to save his wife from her own mistakes. This was a final audit. Arthur reached into his jacket and pulled out a gold pen. He told her that the divorce papers were generous. He wasn't going to leave her with nothing, but he wasn't going to leave her with enough to ever be comfortable without working again. He was giving her exactly what she had given him for 10 years, the bare minimum required to survive, while he kept the luxury for himself. He signed his name with a flourish, the ink drying as fast as his compassion for her. He handed her the pen. He told her that if she signed now, he would ensure her current debts were cleared, but she would have to leave this city and never contact him or his family again. If she refused, he would use his legal team to ensure she fought an uphill battle she couldn't afford for the next decade. Elena looked at the pen, then at the man she had once treated like a servant. The power dynamic had flipped so violently, it made her head spin. She realized that the Arthur who would have done anything for her was dead. She had killed him herself with years of coldness and contempt. With a shaking hand, Elena signed the documents on the trunk of the car. As she finished, Arthur took the papers back and handed them to his driver. He didn't offer her a ride. He didn't offer her a parting hug. He simply told her that he hoped she enjoyed the life she had chosen. He stepped into the car, the door closing with a heavy, expensive thud that sounded like the closing of a tomb. As the sedan pulled away into the night, Elena was left standing on the curb, the smell of expensive exhaust lingering in the air, holding nothing but a cheap gold pen and the crushing weight of a lifetime of regret. The sedan disappeared into the labyrinth of city lights, leaving Elena standing in a vacuum of silence. The gold pen in her hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She looked back at the bistro, the place where she had just been served her own soul on a platter. Her manager was standing at the door, shouting something about a missed table and a customer complaint, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. She couldn't go back in there. She couldn't go back to a life of serving appetizers and faking smiles, while the man she had discarded was living in a world of private jets and boardrooms. The sting of her own stupidity was more painful than any insult Arthur could have hurled at her. She began to walk, her heels clicking rhythmically on the cold pavement. Every block she passed reminded her of a time she had belittled him. There was the park, where he had once suggested they have a picnic because they couldn't afford a restaurant, and she had mocked him for being cheap. There was the bus stop, where she had refused to stand next to him because his work clothes were covered in drywall dust. She realized now that the dust wasn't a sign of failure. It was the foundation of the empire he had eventually built. She had been so focused on the dirt on his hands that she never noticed the brilliance in his mind. Elena reached her studio apartment, a cramped space that smelled of damp plaster and regret. She sat on the edge of her bed, a mattress she had bought secondhand, and stared at the divorce settlement summary Arthur had left her. He was paying off her debts. He was giving her a small lump sum, enough to move to a different town and start over. It was an act of mercy, but to Elena, it felt like the ultimate insult. It was pity money. It was the kind of money a person gives to a stranger they feel sorry for. He didn't even hate her enough to leave her with nothing. He simply didn't care enough to let her struggle. She spent the night scrolling through social media, her fingers trembling as she searched for Zenith development. The results were a punch to the gut. There were photos of Arthur at groundbreaking ceremonies, standing next to mayors and governors. He looked younger, sharper, and more handsome than he ever had when they were together. In one interview, he was asked what drove him to such heights. He had replied, "I realized that the only thing holding me back was my own belief that I owed my life to people who didn't value it." Elena closed her eyes, the words echoing in her head. She was the people. She was the anchor he had finally cut loose. As the sun began to rise, the reality of her situation became crystal clear. She had traded a diamond for a piece of glass. She had seen Julian's flash and ignored Arthur's fire. She thought about calling her mother, the woman who had encouraged her to find someone better, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Her mother would only remind her of how she had failed to secure the bag. In her social circle, there was no room for losers, and Elena was now the biggest loser of them all. She had had the winning ticket in her hand for 10 years and had thrown it in the trash because the paper was a little crumpled. A sense of desperation began to claw at her. Maybe she could find him. Maybe she could go to Oakhaven and wait outside his office. She could wear the dress he used to love, the one he saved up 3 months to buy her for their 5th anniversary. She could tell him she was wrong, that she had been lost, that she was a victim of Julian's manipulation. She convinced herself, in a fit of delusional hope, that Arthur's coldness was just a mask, that deep down he still loved the girl he had married. She didn't understand that Arthur hadn't just changed his clothes, he had changed his soul. She spent the next few days in a manic state, packing her few belongings and using the last of her meager savings to buy a bus ticket to Oakhaven. She ignored the calls from her boss at the bistro. She didn't care about the job anymore. She was going to reclaim her life. She was going to remind Arthur of their history. She spent hours in front of a cracked mirror, practicing her apology, trying to make her eyes look just the right amount of sorrowful. She was an artist, after all. She knew how to compose a scene. But she was about to learn that Arthur was no longer interested in her art. When she arrived in Oakhaven, the sheer scale of Arthur's success hit her like a physical blow. The Zenith logo was everywhere, on cranes, on luxury apartment complexes, on the side of a massive new community center. She felt like an ant walking through a giant's garden. She found the address for his corporate headquarters, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that seemed to touch the clouds. She stood in the lobby, her cheap suitcase at her feet, looking at the directory. Arthur Sterling, CEO. Even his name sounded different, stronger, more permanent. She approached the reception desk, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The polished marble of the Zenith Tower lobby felt like ice under Elena's worn-out shoes. She felt the eyes of the security guards on her sharp, professional eyes that could smell desperation from a mile away. She approached the reception desk, smoothing her hair with a trembling hand. She told the young woman behind the desk, a woman who looked like she stepped out of a fashion magazine, that she was there to see Arthur. Not Mr. Sterling, but Arthur. She tried to project an air of belonging, an air of a woman who had once shared a bed and a life with the man at the top of the tower. The receptionist didn't blink. She asked if she had an appointment. Elena tried to laugh it off, saying she was his wife, well, his partner, and it was a surprise. The receptionist's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something bordering on pity. She tapped a few keys on her keyboard and informed Elena that Mr. Sterling was in a high-level board meeting and was not to be disturbed. Elena persisted, her voice rising in pitch, attracting the attention of several executives walking through the lobby. She began to tell a story of their history, of how she had been his muse, how they had struggled together in the trenches. Before she could finish her performance, a woman in a sharp navy suit stepped out of the elevator. It was Sarah, the attorney from the bistro. She recognized Elena immediately. Sarah didn't approach her with anger. She approached her with the weary patience one uses for a persistent solicitor. She took Elena aside near a massive fountain that drowned out their voices. Sarah told her plainly that she was violating the spirit of the agreement she had signed. She reminded Elena that the pity money Arthur had provided came with a condition of silence and distance. Elena began to cry. Real tears this time, born of the realization that she was being treated like a security threat rather than a queen. She begged Sarah to just give Arthur a message. She said she wanted to apologize, to tell him she was proud of him, to ask for a second chance. Sarah looked at her for a long moment, then checked her watch. She told Elena that if she wanted to see what she was asking for, she should look at the screen in the lounge. On the massive digital display, a news segment was playing. It was a feature on Arthur's latest philanthropic project, a housing complex for families of low-income workers. But it wasn't the buildings that caught Elena's breath. It was the woman standing next to Arthur in the video. She was elegant, radiating a quiet intelligence and a genuine warmth that Elena had never possessed. The reporter identified her as Clara, the lead architect of the project and Arthur's fiancée. The camera captured a moment where Arthur looked at Clara, and the expression on his face was one Elena had never seen, a look of total, unburdened respect and deep, peaceful love. It wasn't the look of a beast of burden trying to please a master. It was the look of a man who had finally found his equal. The sight was a physical blow to Elena's chest. She realized that the space she thought she could just walk back into had been filled by someone better, someone who had likely helped him build the very walls she was currently standing within. Sarah leaned in and whispered that Clara had been there when Arthur had nothing but a small office and a big dream. She had worked for free for 6 months because she believed in his vision. She hadn't waited for him to become a king. She had helped him forge the crown. Elena felt the last of her delusions crumble. She wasn't just a part of his past. She was a cautionary tale in his success story. She was the before to his after. Sarah handed her a card for a local hotel, noting that the room had been paid for 1 night and a one-way bus ticket to a town 3 states away. It was a final, cold gesture of closure. Sarah told her that if she stepped foot in the building again, the police would be called, and the remainder of her settlement would be frozen in litigation for years. Elena walked out of the Zenith Tower, the glass doors hissing shut behind her like a final exhale. The Oakhaven wind was cold, biting through her thin sweater. She looked up at the top floor, where the lights were glowing with the energy of important people making important decisions. She realized that Arthur hadn't just moved on. He had ascended to a height where he couldn't even hear her voice anymore. She was a footnote in a legacy she had tried to prevent. She sat on her suitcase at the bus stop, watching the wealthy residents of the city walk by, and for the first time in her life, she felt the true, hollow weight of being completely, utterly irrelevant. The bus ride to the neighboring state was a blurred nightmare of flickering streetlights and the low hum of a diesel engine. Elena pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching the silhouette of Oakhaven Arthur's city vanish into the darkness. She felt like a ghost being exorcised from a world she no longer belonged to. When she finally arrived at the small, dusty town of Miller's Creek, the air felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of pine and apathy. This was her new reality. This was the fresh start Arthur's lawyers had bought for her. She checked into the modest hotel Sarah had arranged. The room was clean but clinical, lacking any of the character or luxury she had once demanded as her birthright. She sat on the bed and opened the small envelope that contained the remainder of her settlement. It was enough to buy a small, one-bedroom apartment and perhaps a reliable car, but it was not enough to live the life of a socialite. There would be no more designer bags, no more high-end gallery openings, and certainly no more Julian-style fantasies. For a woman who had built her entire identity on being better than others, this was a living death. Over the next few months, Elena tried to rebuild, but the foundation was rotten. She bought a small condo on the outskirts of town, but the walls felt like they were closing in. In a town like Miller's Creek, no one cared that she once ran an art gallery in the city. To them, she was just another newcomer, with a bitter expression and a wardrobe that didn't fit the local climate. She tried to apply for management positions, but her resume was a trail of failures and bankruptcies. Eventually, out of sheer necessity to pay the utilities, she found herself back in the one place she swore she would never return, the service industry. Working at a local diner was a special kind of hell for Elena. Every time she refilled a coffee cup or wiped down a greasy table, she saw Arthur's face in the steam. She remembered how she used to look down at the waitstaff when Arthur took her out, how she would complain if the water wasn't cold enough or the service wasn't fast enough. Now, she was the one being snapped at by impatient truckers and tired mothers. The irony was a jagged pill that she had to swallow every single shift. She had become the very person she used to mock, while the man she had mocked had become a god of industry. One afternoon, while taking a break in the back alley of the diner, she found a crumpled newspaper. On the business page was a headline, "Zenith Development Expands Internationally." There was a photo of Arthur and Clara in London, standing in front of a historic building they were restoring. They looked radiant, a picture of partnership and mutual success. Arthur was smiling a genuine, deep smile that Elena realized she had never actually seen during their 10 years together. She realized then that she hadn't just been a dead weight to his finances, she had been a vacuum of his joy. He hadn't just become rich after she left, he had become happy. She began to obsessively track his success through the internet at the local library. She saw that he was setting up scholarships for trade schools, helping men who started just like he did in the mud, with nothing but a dream. He was building the world she had told him he wasn't good enough to touch. Every article was a fresh wound. She realized that her greatest mistake wasn't just being mean to him, it was failing to see the human being behind the provider. She had treated him like a utility, and once the utility seemed broken, she had tried to replace it. But Arthur wasn't a utility, he was a powerhouse that she had tried to keep in a box. Her health began to decline, not from physical illness, but from the corrosive power of regret. She stopped wearing makeup, she stopped styling her hair. The vanity that had once been her armor was now a heavy burden she couldn't be bothered to carry. She would sit on her small balcony at night, looking at the stars, wondering if Arthur ever thought of her. She hoped he hated her, because hate was at least an emotion. But deep down, she knew the truth. Arthur didn't hate her. To Arthur, she was simply a lesson he had learned and moved on from. She was the shadow that made his current light seem so much brighter. One evening, a regular at the diner, an old man who had seen everything this town had to offer, noticed her staring blankly at the wall. He told her that regret is a ghost that only lives if you feed it. He advised her to let go of whatever she was holding on to. But Elena couldn't let go. If she let go of her regret, she would have nothing left. Her regret was the only thing that connected her to the man in the charcoal suit, the man who once loved her enough to work until his fingers bled. She realized, with a chilling finality, that she was destined to spend the rest of her life as a spectator to a life she could have shared. In the heights of Oakhaven, the air was different. High above the noise of the streets, Arthur stood in his office, his silhouette framed by a sunset that painted the city in shades of gold and copper. He wasn't thinking about the past. His mind was a blueprint for the future. On his desk lay the plans for the Sterling Foundation, a project that would provide housing and education for those who had been discarded by society. For Arthur, success wasn't about the number of zeros in his bank account. It was about the ability to change the reality for people who felt as invisible as he once did. The door opened softly, and Clara walked in. She didn't come with demands or complaints. She came with a cup of coffee and a smile that reached her eyes. She stood beside him, looking out at the skyline they had helped shape together. They didn't need to speak. Theirs was a partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared passion. Clara had seen him at his most vulnerable, during the nights when he doubted his own vision. And she had been the one to remind him that his hands were capable of more than just carrying weight. They were capable of creating beauty. Arthur reached out and took her hand. He thought briefly of the life he had led before, the life in that cramped apartment with the cold dinners and the constant stinging rebukes. It felt like a story he had read in a book a long time ago. He realized that the greatest wealth he had acquired wasn't the penthouse or the prestige. It was the peace of being known and valued for who he was, not just for what he could provide. He told Clara that he wanted to increase the funding for the vocational schools. He wanted to find the beasts of burden of the world and show them they could be architects. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, noting that he had a heart that was too big for his own good. Arthur smiled, a genuine expression of contentment. He knew that some might see his treatment of Elena as cold, but he viewed it as a necessary amputation. You cannot grow a garden if you keep the weeds that choke the roots. By letting her go, he hadn't just saved himself. He had given her the only thing she ever truly wanted, the freedom to find the better life she was always chasing. The fact that she had found it empty was not his burden to carry. As the evening progressed, they attended a gala for the city's new library. Arthur moved through the room with a quiet grace, a man who belonged in any circle he chose to enter. He spoke with engineers, artists, and city leaders. He was no longer the man who hid his intellect to keep the peace. He was a leader. During his speech, he spoke about the importance of resilience. He said that a building is only as strong as its foundation, and a human being is no different. He told the audience that the most beautiful structures in the world are often those that have been rebuilt from the ruins of a fire. Back in Miller's Creek, the local news played a short clip of the gala. Elena sat in her dim living room, the flickering blue light of the television the only thing illuminating her face. She saw Arthur at the podium, looking regal and wise. She saw the way the world leaned in to hear his words. She looked down at her own hands, now rough and stained from the work at the diner, and she finally understood. Arthur hadn't made it because he left her. He had made it because he finally allowed himself to be the man he was always meant to be. She had been the cage, and the moment he stepped out of it, he took flight. The realization was a quiet, heavy stone in her stomach. She turned off the television, unable to watch the man she had lost any longer. She went to her small kitchen and poured a glass of tap water. She thought about the diamond watch she had once demanded he buy her. She realized now that a watch can tell you the time, but it cannot give you back the years you wasted being cruel. She sat in the silence of her apartment, a place that felt more like a cell every day, and realized that her punishment wasn't poverty, it was the memory of the love she had treated like trash. Arthur and Clara left the gala early, preferring the quiet of their own home to the noise of the crowd. As they drove through the city, Arthur looked at the Zenith Tower, its lights a beacon in the night. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for every struggle, every insult, and every hour of overtime. It had all led to this. He was a man who had been reborn, and as he looked at the woman beside him, he knew that the best chapters of his story were still waiting to be written. The past was a closed book, and he had no intention of ever reading it again. The final legal severance arrived on a Tuesday, a day that felt like any other to Arthur, but felt like a funeral to Elena. Sarah had sent the final decree of divorce via a courier to the diner in Miller's Creek. There were no more signatures required, no more meetings in dark bistros, and no more ties. Arthur sat in his study, the golden light of late afternoon reflecting off the polished mahogany desk. He looked at the document for exactly 3 seconds before filing it away in a folder labeled "Closed." To him, this wasn't an ending. It was the final removal of a shadow that had lingered too long on the edges of his bright new world. Arthur turned his attention back to his desk, where a different set of papers waited. These were the blueprints for the Sterling Trade Center. It was his most ambitious project, yet a free school designed to teach craftsmanship, architecture, and engineering to those who lacked the means for a traditional university. He remembered the feeling of being trapped in a life of labor with no path out, and he was determined to build that path for others. He wasn't just building structures anymore. He was building futures. He decided that day to name the main hall after Elias, the man who had first seen the genius beneath his dusty work jacket. In Miller's Creek, Elena held the final divorce decree in her hands behind the counter of the diner. The paper felt cold and clinical. It was the official record that she was no longer connected to the man who was currently being hailed as the visionary of the coast. A group of teenagers at a booth were looking at their phones, laughing at a viral video of Arthur's latest speech. They didn't know the woman serving them lukewarm coffee was the woman who had once stood at that man's side. They didn't know that she was the one who had told him he was nothing. She felt a sudden, violent urge to scream, to tell them that she knew him, that she had owned his heart once. But she stayed silent. She knew they wouldn't believe her. To them, she was just a tired woman in a stained apron. As the weeks turned into months, Arthur's influence grew. He became a symbol of the self-made titan. He and Clara were married in a private ceremony on a cliff overlooking the ocean. It wasn't the flashy media circus wedding Elena had always dreamed of. It was an intimate gathering of people who truly cared for one another. There were no cameras, no social climbers, and no pretension. When Arthur looked into Clara's eyes as they exchanged vows, he felt a level of security he hadn't known was possible. He realized that for years he had been building on sand, but with Clara, he was finally building on bedrock. Elena's life, meanwhile, became a study in the mundane. She had stopped fighting the reality of Miller's Creek. She moved through her shifts like a machine, her eyes dull and her spirit spent. She had tried to date a few local men, but she couldn't help but compare them to the memory of Arthur, or rather, the version of Arthur she had failed to see. She found herself becoming the bitter woman of the town, the one who lived alone and never smiled. She realized that her beauty, the only currency she had ever truly valued, was fading. Without her pride and her husband's paycheck to sustain it, she was just a hollow shell. One night, Elena sat on her porch and looked at the moon. She thought about the night Arthur had left. She wondered if he had known then how far he would go. She wondered if he had left because he hated her, or if he had left because he finally loved himself. The answer was clear now. He hadn't left to get revenge, he had left to survive. She was the poison, and he was the body that had finally fought back. She felt a strange, fleeting moment of clarity, a realization that she had been the architect of her own misery. Every stone of her current life had been laid by her own hands, through every sneer, every insult, and every act of greed. Arthur made one final decision regarding Elena. He instructed Sarah to set up a blind trust that would pay for Elena's medical insurance for the rest of her life. He didn't do it out of love, and he didn't do it because he wanted her to know. He did it so that he could truly say he had fulfilled every possible obligation to the man he used to be. He wanted to be able to look at himself in the mirror and know that he was a man of honor, even to those who had shown him none. It was the ultimate act of closure, a quiet, powerful statement that he was a person of substance, while she remained a person of surface. As the sun set over the Sterling Trade Center on the day of its opening, Arthur stood before a crowd of hundreds. He looked out at the faces of young men and women who looked just like he once did, hungry for a chance, tired of being overlooked. He told them that the world would try to define them by their hands, but they must define themselves by their minds. He told them that no one can keep you in the dark if you carry the light within you. As the ribbon was cut and the doors opened, Arthur felt a final, peaceful click in his heart. The journey was complete. He had turned his pain into a palace. Years passed, and the name Arthur Sterling became synonymous with a new era of architectural grace and social responsibility. The city of Oakhaven flourished under his influence, but Arthur himself became more private, preferring the quiet sanctuary of the home he had built with Clara and their children. He had reached a point where he no longer had anything to prove. The fire of revenge that had once flickered in his chest had long since burned out, leaving behind a steady, warming glow of fulfillment. He had achieved the ultimate victory. He had forgotten the bitterness of the past so completely that it no longer held any power over his present. In the quiet corners of his library, Arthur would sometimes look at an old, framed photograph of the first warehouse he had ever renovated. It was a reminder of the man who had nothing but a duffel bag and a dream. He didn't keep photos of Elena. He didn't need to. She was a ghost from a previous life, a lesson learned and a chapter closed. He had realized that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing her suffer, but living a life so full and meaningful that her existence became a mere footnote in his history. He was a man defined by what he built, not by what had been broken. Far away, in the stagnant air of Miller's Creek, Elena's world continued to shrink. She had become a fixture at the diner, a woman whose face was etched with the lines of 1,000 what-ifs. She lived in a cycle of gray days and silent nights, the gold pen Arthur had given her years ago sitting in a velvet-lined box on her nightstand, the only expensive thing she owned. She often found herself staring at it, wondering how one person could be so blind to the treasure they held until it was gone. She had spent her youth looking for a shortcut to the top, only to realize that the only path worth taking was the one she had refused to walk with Arthur. On a particularly cold winter evening, Elena sat by her small heater, watching a documentary about the world's most influential philanthropists. When Arthur's face appeared on the screen, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply felt a profound, hollow ache in her chest. The narrator spoke of his humble beginnings and the mysterious departure that sparked his rise to power. They called it a mystery of fate. Elena knew better. It wasn't fate. It was the consequence of her own cruelty. She was the one who had pushed him out the door, never realizing she was pushing away her only chance at true happiness. As the credits rolled, Elena looked out her window at the snow falling on the empty streets. She was a woman who had once demanded the world and ended up with a corner of a forgotten town. She finally understood that wealth isn't just about the money in your bank account. It's about the character of the person standing beside you. She had been so focused on the glitter that she had ignored the gold. Now, at the end of her story, she was left with nothing but the cold reflection of a life wasted on vanity. She closed her eyes, the silence of her apartment echoing the silence of a heart that had learned its lesson far too late. The story of Arthur and Elena serves as a powerful reminder that we should never despise the humble beginnings of those around us. Respect is a currency that never devalues, and kindness is an investment that always pays off. Arthur rose because he had the strength to leave behind those who didn't see his worth, and Elena fell because she couldn't see past her own reflection. In the end, the architecture of our lives is built on the choices we make and the people we choose to cherish. Thank you for joining us on Dr. Harmony for this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own strength, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. We love hearing your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us, have you ever had a phoenix moment in your own life? Your support helps us bring more of these powerful stories to life. Until next time, stay grounded, stay inspired, and remember that your value is not defined by those who fail to see it.